Next thing I'm going to talk about is the impact of the life cycle on health and wellness. So we don't necessarily think about this objectively all that much, but depending on your age, you are at risk for lots of very different types of medical problems. So the types of health issues that we see in infants are very different from the types of health issues that we see in elderly people, for example. So I'm going to take you through the stages of the human life cycle and talk about some of the major causes of death and disability in those age groups. So death is pretty clear cut, right? So an end to your life. Disability is something that impacts the quality of your life or negatively impacts your ability to function in the world for a variety of reasons, okay? So let's take a look. So, I guess my little video square is over the very elderly. So I don't quite qualify as very elderly yet. But you can see on the bottom here kind of, our lifespan. And I've included in this slide the fetal period, right? So when we are inside our mother's wombs, we are vulnerable to particular diseases at that time. And then into the newborn or neonatal period, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, young adults. Working in middle adults, which you'll see is kind of the biggest bucket. So it spans a 40-year period of time right there. And then older adults and then very elderly would be the over 85 group. So if we take a look, in the fetal period, the predominant cause of death is genetic defects. So we're talking about miscarriages here, and it's almost always due to an error in the genetic code that is incompatible with life. Sometimes there are also injuries that occur to the fetus, either because the pregnant person has an infection or consumes a substance that is toxic to the fetus. But the vast majority of times it was a genetic anomaly. Just when sperm met egg, we didn't get quite the right lineup there. And so it's just a genetic code that's incompatible with life. So that's the fetal period. For once you're born and you're in that early infancy period, that neonatal period, it's still genetic defects are the largest contributors to death. But being born premature is also a huge risk to the life of an infant because they're not done developing yet. So they're not quite ready for prime time. They're not quite able to breathe on their own. They're not quite able to eat and digest and absorb nutrients on their own. And so prematurity is one of the leading causes of death in the very young. And it's SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome, which is a fascinating condition and probably represents multiple different medical conditions altogether, is one of the biggest causes of death in that early infancy period. When you move into toddlerhood, for the most part, then we're looking at infections. So even in the United States, where we have excellent vaccination campaigns, we have excellent access to healthcare for most but not all people, we have availability of antibiotics, infections still are a big cause of death in that age group, followed by injuries. So accidental injuries, car accidents, drownings, falls, those types of things. Now, there are not many of these deaths, so I didn't put in here, but the book has in the table kind of how often deaths occur in this age group, and they occur very rarely in this age group, but when they do occur, these are their causes. When you move into school-age children, and the younger school-age children, we're still seeing injuries, car accidents, drownings, those types of things as the major causes of death. But then we also start to see the childhood cancers. They tend to start usually around age 5 to 7 to 10. We start to see leukemias and some other unusual cancers. These are still very rare overall. People in this age group don't die very often, but when they do, it's usually from injuries and then cancer. And then once you get to age 10, we start to see suicide creeping up. So that becomes the number 3 cause of death in this age group. As we move into adolescence and young adulthood, which is where many of you are still, injuries are still really high, and we start to see homicide actually, so death by violence, it becomes a lot more common, obviously in certain communities more than others, and then suicide remains a leading cause of death in this age group. Again, Death in this age group is really uncommon, but when it occurs, it's usually injuries, homicide, or suicide. In terms of disability now, we're starting to see the appearance of things that cause a decrease in function or well-being. And so in adolescents and young adults, by far, the major cause of disability is mental health disorders. So depression and anxiety by far lead the pack here. We also see some disability from things like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder that can cause difficulties for people in their life functioning. As we move into the working adult or middle adult population, again, on that younger end, we're still going to see injuries. So car accidents. And then now we're starting to see a lot of drug overdoses. So a lot of, especially in this country, deaths due to opioid overdose are skyrocketing. So that's a big problem, as you're aware. We also then, toward the end of this period, right, because this is this big bucket. So once we get kind of over age 50, now we're starting to see cancer and heart disease come onto the scene. They have, we had a blip of them in childhood, and then young adulthood, usually we don't see a lot of cancers, and then we don't usually see them in the 20s and 30s, and even in the 40s, and then once we get into our 50s and 60s, cancers really start cropping up again, as well as heart disease. And in terms of disability, now we're also seeing musculoskeletal disorders. You might be like, well, what's that? Well, back pain is the big one. So we see a lot of back pain in this population, sometimes due to occupational injuries, right, due to their work, sometimes due to other types of injuries, and chronic pain and back pain become significant causes of disability in this group. We continue to see disability due to mental health disorders. That is a persistent challenge. As we move into older adults, now cancer and heart disease are going to predominate as the major causes of death. And in terms of disability, stroke, which is sometimes fatal, but in this age group often not, but can leave you with lots of deficits. And then Alzheimer's disease, which is the major cause of dementia in this country. So we're starting to see loss of function and wellness due to stroke and Alzheimer's disease in this population. And then once we get over age 85, heart disease and cancer are the major causes of death. Heart disease and cancer are the major causes of death, period. None of us are getting out of this world alive, right? Life is a terminal illness. Something has to kill you, and usually it's going to be that your heart fails or that you develop cancer. Them's the facts. In terms of the major cause of disability, now dementia is really the leading cause in that age group. So depending on what age you are, different health conditions or diseases are going to become more or less relevant. So that's going to be really important as we think about the health of a population and think about what are the issues that are going to be most important at that population level. Okay, so this slide is because I'm sorry to say that I lied on the last slide. So your book used to have a table of total number of deaths by age group, but in the new edition, it does not have that. So I went and found our preliminary number of deaths in the United States in 2022. So this is part of those vital statistics that we talked about in the history of public health. So we now have this information. And so what you can see is that most of the deaths that occur in this country happen in older people, right? So by far, the vast majority of deaths happen in people who are over age 85. So almost 1 million of those per year. And then slightly less 75 to 84, slightly less 65 to 74, and then it really drops off. So young people, aside from infancy, because in infancy, we're still seeing some deaths due to things like congenital heart defects, right? So we're seeing genetic defects, congenital defects, deaths that can occur in that really early infancy, newborn period. But then once you make it to a year old, right, we don't see a lot of deaths in toddlers and young school-age children. They can have those accidents, right, but for the most part, they don't typically die, which would fit with your lived experience. Now, if you look at this, this is just total numbers of deaths that occur in the United States. You would think, well, gosh, people who are over over 85 aren't really all that much likely more to die compared to people who are 75. And actually, that's not true because there are fewer people who are 85 and up. So the fact that we see so many deaths means that those folks are at really high risk of death. So to kind of control for the differences in sizes of the population, we're going to look at something called a death rate. So I'm going to show that to you in the next slide. So these are death rates by age in the United States, and the reference is at the bottom if you want to go take a look at this. So in individuals who are 85 and over, you can see out of all the people who exist who are in that age group, 15,000 for every 100,000 who exist end up dying within a year. So if you kind of do the math, right, that's the same as 15 per 100 or 15%. So if I'm 85 or older, I have about statistically a 15% chance per year that I'm going to die. Whereas folks who are in that 75 to 84 range, it's more about 5,000 out of every 100,000 who die in a year. So that's like a 5%. So you're 3 times as likely to die once you're over 85. Kind of makes sense, right? We can't live forever. If you've made it that long, you know, your time is definitely running out. And so again, you can see very, very low rates for young people, working age people, a little bit higher in the under 1 year, again, because of congenital defects. All right, so those are the actual numbers. So you can see the vast differences by age group. And then in the next few slides, I'm going to show you one of my absolute favorite websites that allows us to look graphically and to see visually what are the major causes of deaths or disability in the different age groups. So here is one of my favorite websites. I'll have you play around with it for one of your activities this unit. And so this is a website maintained by the University of Washington, and they have this incredible database of data about causes of death and disability, and lots of different ways that they produce these visualizations of it. So what we're looking at right here is you can see, let's see, I'm going to use my little highlighter, I think. So, oh, look over here, I have selected deaths in the United States of America for people under the age of 5, right? So that's kind of how I've set it up. And so what you can see, and I don't think you can see my arrow. All right, so we can see, whoops, hello, congenital causes, right? So those congenital defects are still common. Neonatal, these are things like prematurity, complications of prematurity. And then here is SIDS down here, that's sudden infant death syndrome. You can also see, you know, foreign body, right? So this is choking, right, as a major cause of death in this age group. So that's in the under 5s. Now I'm going to switch and we're going to look at 5 to 14 and take a look at the changes. Wow, huge change, right? So once you get to age 5, look over here, road injuries, right? So motor vehicle accidents. All of, let's see, these over here are the cancers. We still have some congenital defects, and then we're starting to see suicide, right? So those are the major causes in this age group. Now you see their age groups are a little bit differently bracketed than the ones I talked about before. That's a problem that we're going to see actually in our country. There's no standard for what exact ages we group populations by. So depending on what organization's data you're looking at, it will be grouped differently. So if you're looking at the state of Wisconsin versus CDC, for example, they use different age ranges. It's really frustrating. Different countries, other countries don't have this problem, but we do. Okay, so let's move on. Ages 15 to 49, huge change again. So we're still seeing car accidents, we're still seeing suicide. Now, these are drug overdoses. So this is my age group for another 6 months. So these are the things that these folks are most at risk for. Then up here, all of these together are cancers. And then this right here is heart disease. Let's see, can I make a heart? No, not really. I'm not very talented. Okay, so we're starting to see those crop up now as the population ages. Let's move on. So ages 50 to 69. Now look, okay, here's heart disease. Oh, I forgot I was going to draw heart. So there's heart disease here. And then where is my, whoops, here it is. Over here, these are all the cancers, right? So those are going to be the major causes of death in people ages 50 to 69. And then they do 70 plus. So for 70 plus, in terms of causes of death, again, here's our heart disease. Here's stroke. That's supposed to be an S. And here is cancer, right? So these are going to be our big causes of death. And then down here is lung disease, a big L for that, lung disease from smoking. And then down here is Alzheimer's dementia, right? Which is going to be the predominant cause of death in the very elderly. So very different things to be concerned about health-wise, depending on the ages of the people in your population. So not only is it going to be different by age, but it's also going to be different based on where you are. So one of the things I really love about that website is you can look at different regions of the world. So as an example, here are the deaths, causes of death, ages 15 to 49 in the United States. And I'm going to show you the causes of death for the same age group in South Africa. Hugely different, hugely different. So this huge dark, let's see, right? This right here, that's HIV. So HIV is the major killer of working age adults in the country of South Africa by far. It far exceeds anything else. I don't even see drug overdoses on there, nor do I see heart disease, right? They still have self-harm, they still have suicide, they still have violence, they still have road injuries, but the vast percentage, the largest percentage of their deaths is caused by HIV. And so as we think about those determinants of disease that we talked about before, and we think about, well, what's different between South Africa and the United States? And so remember, one of the determinants that we talked about was biology, right? So we talked about kind of your genetics or your biology. So are the genetics or biology of people who live in South Africa very different from people who live in the United States? And it turns out no. So there's nothing biologically that makes them more vulnerable to HIV than people in the United States. We are genetically far, far, far more similar than we are different. And there's nothing about our genetic code that confers an advantage or disadvantage in terms of HIV. Now, what about health behaviors, right? So are health behaviors very different between the United States and South Africa? Well, in terms of number of unprotected sex partners, no, actually, they're not very different at all. Just as many people are having unprotected sex in the United States as are having unprotected sex in South Africa. There are a few differences in behavior. In South Africa, it is more common to have several different partners at the same time. Rather, in Western countries, it's more common to have serial monogamy, where you'll be with somebody for a period of time and then with somebody else and then with somebody else. Whereas in South Africa, it's a little bit more common to have, a couple of sexual partners at the same time. So there's a little bit of difference in health behaviors. What about medical care? Is there a difference in access to medical care? A little bit. It's not huge. Actually, South Africa has a pretty well-developed medical and health system. There is a little bit of difficulty in access to some things, but for the most part, it's fairly equivalent to the United States. So we're left with that last chunk, right? That purple chunk, those social characteristics, the total ecology, the total environment in which you live. And one of the major differences why the HIV death rate is so high in South Africa is just because there's a lot of HIV around. So the likelihood that any partner you have has HIV and could infect you is about 100 times higher in South Africa than it is in the United States. They just have more of it around, so it's easier to catch, right? Which then perpetuates that cycle of there being more of it around, and so it's easier to catch. We also see differences in terms of education and culture around condom use and safer sex. So really, again, those purple things, those social and societal factors, that total ecology in which you live, is the major driver of this difference that we see in HIV infection rates and death rates between the United States and South Africa. Oh, I will say one thing that is very different, medical care wise, I forgot to bring it up, is access to HIV treatment. So medications to keep HIV in check and extend your lifespan once infected with HIV. We have much more access to that here in the United States. So that is also another powerful factor. All right, so things vary a lot from place to place because of all those factors, especially that big purple one.